Cushites. 5. Skeptics might well point out that if the Cushites were really responsible for saving Judah, it would follow that the Judahites of the time and of the next several generations would have a positive attitude towards them. They might note that several passages in the Bible that deal with Cushites are, in opinion of the overwhelming majority of biblical experts, decidedly hostile towards the African people. For example, one internationally respected authority on the biblical text in question, Denmark's Erlings Hammershaimb, makes this flat assertion about Cush: its dark-skinned inhabitants were held in contempt by the Israelites. Since these biblical texts were written within several centuries of Sennacherib's invasion, wouldn't their anti-Cushite tone severely undermine the idea that Cushites had helped Hebrews? Yes, it would. But there is one problem. The premise of such a conclusion is false. The mainstream scholars' view that the Hebrew Bible Old Testament expresses contempt for the Cushites is a delusion. In fact, the experts have it backwards. The opposite of contempt is honor. And that's just what the Bible shows. Generally speaking, the Hebrew Bible treats the people of foreign nations pejoratively. As in the case with the Philistines, Canaanites, and Hittites, often this reflects the fact that the Bible says that Hebrews were at war with them, or in the case of lower Egyptians, in Moses' story, that the Hebrews were suffering under their oppression. But even in situations that are free of conflict, in Isaiah's allusion to Judah's attempt to obtain military aid from lower Egypt, the Bible's tone is describing other nations is frequently scornful. In many cases, these foreign nations' isolation from Yahweh would explain the attitude. No such negativism exists in regards to the Cushites. While the final version of the Hebrew Bible does not explicitly give credit to the Cushites for Jerusalem's rescue, it nonetheless depicts them in exceptionally generous terms. While this respectful attitude does not necessarily attest to Hebrew recognition of Cush for service rendered in 701 BC, it's consistent with such recognition. The Old Testament mentions Cush or Cushite and the ancient synonym Ethiopians or Ethiopian a total of 56 times. These occur in 29 passages. I cannot find a single passage that clearly reflects negatively on Cushites. Those who see the Hebrew Bible as scornful of Cushites often cite Amos 9:7 in support of their view. The verse reads, Are not you Israelites the same to me as the Cushites, declares the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines, and from Caphtor, and the Armenians from Kir? Amos preached in Israel in the mid-8th century BC, but this particular passage appears to have been added sometime within 2 centuries after 701. Hammershaimb authored the book on Amos and professor of Semitic Studies in the University of Aarhus, says that Yahweh is refuting those who boast that the Lord's preference for Israel will prevent it from coming to harm. Following the deep-seated view of prominent biblical scholars on both sides of the Atlantic, Hammershaimb says the meaning of the passage is that Yahweh must not think that they have an advantage at all, even over so despised a nation as the Cushites. James Luther Mays of the Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, is of the same opinion, saying that the comparison to the lowly Cushites is shameful to the Israelites. He writes, On the evidence, one can say no more than that the Cushites were distant, different folk whom the Israelites knew mostly as slaves. You are to me, says Yahweh, as these Cushites are to you. What the comparison does is to humiliate Israel completely with respect to Yahweh, to reduce them to the role in Yahweh's order of things which the Cushites played in their own society. One U.S. theologian noted for his progressive views on racial issues is Abraham J. Herschel, 1907 to 1972, who was active in the civil rights movement and marched in Selma in 1965 next to Martin Luther King Jr., a professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York. Herschel has this to say on the Amos passage. The nations chosen for this comparison were not distinguished for might and prestige, countries such as Egypt and Assyria, but rather nations that were despised and disliked. The color of the Ethiopians is black, and in those days many of them were sold on the slave markets. Indeed, even a scholar with a disposition to manifestly sympathetic to the Cushites as Edwards Ollendorff, professor of Ethiopian studies in the University of London, perceives hostility in Amos 9:7. The climactic reference to these words, he says, can only be fully appreciated if the Ethiopians serve in the present context as an epitome of a far distant, uncivilized, and despised black race. He makes this observation in a book entitled Ethiopia and the Bible. His view surely qualifies as an expert opinion. Perhaps the most weighty of all the opinions is that of David Noel Friedman, a professor of Hebrew Biblical Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and editor-in-chief of the scholarly Anchor Bible. Friedman is one of the most eminent and prolific biblical experts in North America. Yet, in his 1989 commentary on the Book of Amos, co-authored by Francis I, and Anderson of Fuller Theological Seminary in California, also regards the passage's likening of Hebrews to Cushites as unfavorable to Hebrews. Their commentary says, the dialectic of verse 7 could be, aren't you like the Cushites, just another enslaved and exploited people under the Egyptians? Answer, no, there is a difference. You, Yahweh, delivered us, Israel, from the bondage in Egypt. The response is, but I also did the same for the other peoples, the Philistines and Armenians, too, to name but the two most familiar to Israel, emphasis added. In other words, Freeman and Anderson view Cushites as a people so undistinguished that the Hebrews shrink from being compared to them. Two other recent American commentaries on Amos state similar opinions, one going so far as to say that the passage serves to desacralize Israel. This consensus view that the verses cast Cushites as contemptible or lowly is simply missing its point. In equating Israelites and Cushites, the biblical writer is not putting Israelites down. Other interpretations present themselves. One is that the comparison is neutral. Today, someone might say to Americans, why should God look out for the United States' interests any more than, say, Mexico or Japan? That would not necessarily imply contempt toward those countries. Another possibility or likelihood is the comparison reflects on the Israelites in a manner that is actually quite positive. Far-fetched, let's see. To back up his contention that the Hebrews felt outright contempt for the Cushites, Hamershab presents just one other piece of evidence, Jeremiah 13:23, addressing sinful Judahites. The prophet of the late 7th century and early 6th century BC says, "Can an Ethiopian change his spots, or can an Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard its spots? Neither can you do good who are accustomed to evil." There is no hint of scorn for blacks here there is no more hint for scorn for blacks here than there is for leopards. A white person today who used such an example might be deemed insensitive, but only because racism is all around us. The racial climate in the Eastern Mediterranean in ancient times was relatively benign. It is a mistake to project back to those times, and as many biblical experts do, today's widespread racial attitudes. In ancient times, the racial climate was unlike anything we know today. In his 1990 investigation of racial views in the Middle East, Bernard Lewis of Princeton University's Department of Near Eastern Studies is emphatic. Race was of minor importance in antiquity. He adds, like every other society known in human history, the ancient Middle Eastern peoples harbored all kinds of prejudices and hostilities towards those whom they regarded as other. But Lewis stresses that evidence suggests that other was primarily defined by cultural differences. The Mediterranean world had some contacts with Ethiopia and China, which were both respected, and there is no real evidence in Jewish or Greek or Roman sources of lower esteem for darker skin or higher esteem for lighter complexions. Other researchers have reached similar conclusions after steeping myself in Hebrew, Assyrian, and Greek texts that deal with interracial situations. These assessments ring utterly true to me. In the 24 other passages referring to Cush and its people, not once does the Hebrew Bible cast aspersions on the Cushites' national character, way of life, or religion. Most of the Cushite references are brief, a verse here, a line there. The longest is in the book of Numbers, chapter 12. All 16 verses of that describe the aftermath of Moses' marriage during the exodus to the Cushite woman. In this story, Moses' sister and brother, Miriam and Aaron, opposed the marriage for unspecified reasons, but presumably because the woman is from outside of the Hebrew fold. The narrative almost certainly dates from well after 701. It is important to stress that the number story is remarkably supportive of the marriage. In response to Miriam's criticism of the betrothal, Yahweh afflicts Miriam with leprosy and her skin turns white as snow. Moses, let us remember, was not just another heroic figure like Joshua or Solomon. He was the Hebrew nation's lawgiver, the mortal whom Yahweh chose to show people how to be. It would be hard to overemphasize the moral weight implicit in such a figure's choice of spouse. One of the 20th century's most acclaimed biblical scholars, Martin Noth of Germany, has written that the term Cush in the story refers not to the African nation, but the Cushan, an area of Arabia or possibly present-day Jordan. Noth is one of several specialists who scoffs at the likelihood of an interracial marriage. Such views may testify to mainstream scholarship's familiarity with Cush's role in the Eastern Mediterranean affairs. Might it make sense to do so, as Martin Luther did in the 16th century, in taking the story at face value, see Moses' wife as African? Yes. Consider first that the story could have had Yahweh punishing Miriam in 1,000 different ways, yet the story employs the one that renders her skin white as snow. In terms of irony, there are more perfect forms of retribution. It is also significant that Flavius Josephus himself, the Jewish historian of the 1st century AD, appears to believe that the woman to be from Cush, not Cushan. Another of the Bible's favorable references to Cush comes in the book of Jeremiah, the same prophet whom Hammashab sees in effect as racist. Prior to the Babylonian army's destruction of Jerusalem in 586, Jeremiah here predicts that the Babylonians' victory and urges the people of the city to flee for their lives. Fearful that such talk could make soldiers lose their courage, royal officials lower the prophet into an empty cistern, a well-like cavity often the size of a room, used for storing water. Because they give him no food, this is like a death sentence. The king of Judah, Zedekiah, gives his assent to this punishment. The only person to object is a Cushite eunuch, Abimelech, who works in the royal palace. He protests to the king, "Your Majesty, what these men have done is wrong." Although Abimelech probably occupies a senior position at the court, for him to challenge a royal decision would take a considerable audacity. The king duly orders the prophet raised. In the subsequent slaughter and deportation at the hands of Babylonians, Yahweh spares the caring Abimelech. Yahweh tells him, "I will keep you safe, and you will not be put to death. You will escape with your life because you have put your trust in me." Like Moses' wife, Abimelech is only a minor biblical character, but his portrayal is highly sympathetic. Nothing in these two characterizations supports the prevailing scholarly view that the ancient Hebrews looked askance at Cushites. Quite the contrary. Let us look at one of the Bible's most misinterpreted passages in the book of Genesis. In the past centuries, people of European background used the text to justify slavery. In the mid-20th century, some white Americans invoked it to justify racial segregation. Fortunately, many modern scholars and clergy have correctly interpreted the text and have labored to puncture the myth it has created. The passage, Genesis 9, chapter 9, verses 18 to 27, tells the story of Noah after the flood had receded. The sons of Noah who went on the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Then Noah awoke from his wine and knew that what his youngest son had done to him. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of the slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord my God." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. By designating him as the flood's survivor, Yahweh had given Noah and humanity a second chance, but now he becomes drunk. His nakedness underscores his shame. We recall how earlier in Genesis, Adam and Eve, suddenly aware of their nakedness, is presented as a symptom of their loss of innocence. After he learns that his son has seen him naked and in addition has cruelly told his brothers of the spectacle, Noah feels doubly humiliated. So strong is his bitterness that the patriarch sets this terrible curse on Canaan and all his descendants. For many centuries, this has been known as the curse of Ham. Ham was commonly deemed to be the progenitor of the black race. Ham is the father not only of Canaan, but of also Cush, Egypt, and Put, commonly identified as either Somalia or Libya, because Noah declared that Canaan should toil as the lowest of slaves. For Shem and Japheth, who were seen as progenitors of other races, some whites in the southern United States and elsewhere, have seen this as a legitimization of black slavery and more recently of separation of the races. Many enemies of racism have pointed out that blatant fallacy of seeing in the Ham story a justification for subjugation. Noah never curses Ham. Instead, he curses one of Ham's four sons, Canaan, who became the ancestor of the Hebrews' Canaanite neighbors, who happened to be as Semitic as the Hebrews themselves. A.F. Walls, director of the Center of Christianity in the non-Western world in Great Britain, sums up this distortion pithily. Despite a long tradition of perverted exegesis in some quarters, there is nothing to connect the curse of Ham with a permanently divinely instituted malediction on the Negroid people. It is explicitly applied to Canaanites. Looking today in the notorious curse of Ham, one can see its very existence to be grotesque nonsense and a transparent instance of text twisting. It is a wonder that it could have become so widespread, yet some other Cushite discrediting interpretations of the Bible are also preposterous. And unlike the curse of Ham, they have maintained their credibility and are still prevalent. It is in the book of Isaiah that one finds the closest to a truly unfavorable reference to the Cushites. The references concern events leading up to the crisis of 701. Most scholars deem them all to be authentic to the historical Isaiah. These passages show the prophet's skepticism, not the same thing as negativism towards the capacity of the Cushites to cope with the mighty Assyrians. One passage, Isaiah chapter 18, verses 1 through 6, which may date from the same months or possibly even years prior to Assyrian invasion, describes an event that takes place as ambassadors from Cush visit Kor. If any biblical scholars assume the prophet had once been a diplomat or a member of Judah's royal court, he might have been in a position to be aware of the nature of the envoy's purpose. In this passage, Isaiah bids the ambassadors return home. He says they should report back, presumably to the Pharaoh, that if the Cushites engage the enemy, their corpses will be left to the birds of prey and the wild animals. The implicit reason, which he spells out elsewhere, is that the Lord is using Assyrians as an instrument to crush the Hebrews. Resistance to Yahweh's will is futile. For all this, however, the prophet is respectful of Cush itself. He speaks to the ambassadors of your strong and powerful nation, your tall and smooth-skinned people who are feared all over the world. Another translator says people of glossy skin. Another still speaks of a polished, gleaming skin. Nothing here is pejorative. In another statement, Isaiah 31, the prophet refers to Cushite Egypt in the similar vein. Here the date may be early in 701 BC, probably after Hezekiah had become aware that Sennacherib will soon invade. Judah's desperate appeal to Cushite Egypt for military help, Isaiah says, is doomed. Arms and troops are not what will stop Yahweh, who's acting through his Assyrian agents, will rise against the house of the evildoers and against the helpers of those who work iniquity. Some scholars seem to assume that the prophet includes Egypt in his condemnation of those who work in iniquity. He is not. What he is denouncing is the Judahite establishment for its evil and iniquitous deeds. Egypt's forces will suffer not because they have done wrong, but because, as the Hebrew kingdom's helpers, they are in the way. They're innocent victims. A third passage, Isaiah 20, shares this theme, explicitly composed at least 3 years after the Assyrians' victorious campaign in 713 and 712 against the rebellious Philistine city of Ashdod. And at the time when Egypt is under Cushite rule, the prophet warns against relying on Cush and Egypt in any future conflict with Assyria. As in the previous passage, Isaiah 31, he anticipates that mounting tensions in Judah-Assyrian relations, perhaps because of Hezekiah's attempt to enlarge his kingdom, will lead to war. Isaiah also foresees Judah calling to Cushite Egypt for help. The prophet says that Yahweh warns that in such a conflict, the Assyrians will lead away Judah's Egyptian and Cushite allies with buttocks uncovered to the shame of Egypt. This vivid image of POWs is one of humiliation, yet there is no hint of negative sentiments towards these people themselves. On the contrary, Isaiah presents these prospective allies from the Nile simply as potential victims of Judah's folly. He predicts that the rebellious people of the Philistine coast may look at the Cushite and Egyptian prisoners of war being marched off and say, "See, this is what happens with those in whom we hoped and to whom we fled for help and deliverance from the king of Assyria." How shall we escape? This is a strong compassion for these Cushites and Egyptians whom the prophet fears Judah's hawks may soon lead to disaster. It is precisely because Judahites have a high regard for Egypt under the 25th dynasty that Isaiah is theologically troubled. Thus, it is still another passage set in the 701 crisis, Isaiah 30. Yahweh denounces a rebellious Yahweh denounces as rebellious the Judahites who set out to go down to Egypt without asking my counsel, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Francolino Gonçalves makes this acute observation of the prophet's thoughts. In seeking their security in Egypt and Egyptian power, Judahites are exchanging Yahweh, their only true refuge, for Egypt, and that makes them guilty of real idolatry. For Isaiah, says this commentator, this idolatry is more subtle than that which involves the worship of idols made of metal and wood, but is no less grave and dangerous. Again, the prophet is in no way upset with Cushite Egypt for what it is, only with what it isn't, that it is not Yahweh. These passages on Egypt these passages on Egypt of the 25th dynasty date from before Sennacherib's retreat. It is clear that they show that the Judahites in general during the pre-deliverance period looked up to Cushite Egypt, and that the prophet himself had a fairly open attitude towards it. But does First Isaiah, that is, the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah, contain any hints of how it views Cushites in the post-invasion time period? If the Cushites played the role in repelling the Assyrians that I think they did, one would have to assume that they would receive attention that was still more positive. When the words of Isaiah were edited sometime later, a process about which little is known, the opportunity existed for adding positive comments on the Cushites. I know of only one clear-cut instance where, after the historical Isaiah's lifetime, a positive comment appears to have been added to statements that were authentic to the prophet, but that single case is significant. This late addition, Isaiah 18, verse 7, says, "A time is coming when the Lord Almighty will receive offerings from this land divided by rivers. This strong and powerful nation, this tall and smooth-skinned people who are feared all over the world, they will come to Mount Zion, where the Lord Almighty is worshipped." In other words, the Cushites were more than military allies. They were also potentially theological allies. They go to Zion itself, Jerusalem, to pay respect to Yahweh. The verse describes a noble solidarity between Hebrews and Cushites, and interestingly, it does so in the context of Assyrian confrontation, to which the preceding verses allude. Another post-701 allusion to Cush is found in Psalm 68. Let envoys come from Egypt. Let Cush eagerly stretch forth her hands to God. This psalm's representation of Cushites as worshipful of Yahweh is highly favorable to them. It reinforces the sense seen in Isaiah 18, verse 7, that Cush possesses a most unusual and commendable respect for Zion. One of the most puzzling of all the biblical allusions to Cush relates to the Garden of Eden. The book of Genesis describes the 4 rivers that water the corners of the earth, but whose headwaters are in Eden. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one that flows from around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bedlam, a resin used for incense, and oxen stones are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates, emphasis added. By linking the 4 rivers to paradise, this passage in Genesis 2 gives extraordinary lofty status to each. The Tigris and the Euphrates, of course, are 2 celebrated rivers of the ancient world, whose ties to the Hebrews, according to a later chapter of Genesis, go back to Abraham, who journeyed to the Promised Land from the Mesopotamian city of Ur. The identity of the Pishon River and the land of Havilah, however, is uncertain. One hypothesis is that they refer to Arabia. Iran was advanced several decades ago as the location for both the Pishon and the Gihon. In a 1998 book, a best-selling British writer, David Rawle, had attempted unconvincingly to locate the Gihon, the Pishon, and Eden itself in another part of Iran. The Chai Valley in the northwestern corner of the country, just west of the Caspian Sea. One can understand the modern researchers' reluctance to identify the Gihon River of Genesis with the Gihon Spring of Jerusalem. The Gihon Spring's gushing flow is equivalent to that of a modest brook, negligible compared with that of the great Tigris and Euphrates. Yet, for Jerusalem, the Gihon, which in Hebrew means bursting forth, was of seminal importance. Without this unique source of water, the city, located as it is amid arid hills, would never have been founded, circa 3000 BC. It was vital in theological terms as well. Many people of that part of the world revered what one specialist in the subject, Richard J. Clifford, has called a cosmic mountain, a sacred elevation involved in the government and stability of the cosmos. These mountains were, among other things, the source of water and fertility. For many Jerusalemites, of course, the sacred mountain was Mount Zion, and it was the Gihon that gushed from it. A psalm about Zion gives the Gihon a joyously sacred function. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. Indeed, the Gihon spring was of such sacramental importance that, according to 1 Kings 1, that elderly David, failing in health, saw to it that his son Solomon was made king at a ceremony at the Gihon, anointed there with holy oil. Clifford supports the identification of the river in Genesis with Jerusalem's spring. John Levinson authored a book on Zion as the cosmic mountain, also suggests Genesis means just what it says when it names the Gihon as one of the four rivers of paradise. The professor of Jewish studies at Harvard points out that it is naive to read a description of the primordial paradise in terms of scientific cartography. He adds that the mythic mind makes associations according to a logic of its own, which is impressionistic and non-scientific. To say that the mind of ancient Israel did not make the equation between the Gihon of Genesis and the Gihon of 1 Kings is indeed to strain the imagination. Now, to the reference in Genesis 2 to the place to which the Gihon flows, Cush. Where would Cush have been located? The question is important. The Genesis text appears to say, in effect, that Cush is a designation of the water of Zion, such as context would suggest that the writers of Genesis saw Cush, whatever its real geographical identity might have been, in an extremely favorable light. Taken at face value, Cush would have corresponded to the land south of Egypt. Yet literalists would see a problem with this. No brook, they say, could roll from Jerusalem across the Sinai into the heartland of Africa. Also, those who see ancient Hebrews as disdainful of Cushites would see this sacred linkage between the two nations as theologically absurd. This may help explain why some scholars have struggled to find other interpretations of Cush. Yet two prominent biblical scholars say Cush is probably the familiar Cush of Africa. They are Claus Westermann of the University of Heidelberg and Bevard Childs of the Yale Divinity School. However, neither Westermann nor Childs, despite having written a thoughtful book on the 701 crisis, discern significance in the symbolic association between Zion and Cush. Neither explores its possible ramifications. The origin of the rivers of Eden passage is probably post-701. It would be reasonable then to suggest that the allusion to Cush as the Gihon's destination reflects the special relationship that flourished between Jerusalem and its southern ally during Hezekiah's reign. One scholar who thinks so is Manfred Gurg of the University of Munich, who says not only that Cush should be taken as the African kingdom, but also it is possibly an allusion to the special context of Jerusalem under Hezekiah, with the Egyptian neighbor dominated by the 25th dynasty. Emphasis added. Gourd continues, this view may be strengthened by considering the prophetic vision of a spring gushing forth from the temple as a utopic description of a river growing up to a stream of universal relevance. In the light of this book's presentation of the events of 701, Gurg's conjecture gains credibility. I'm not aware, however, of any significant discussion by scholars of this important symbolic linkage. The simple solution to the puzzle over Eden-related topography is to accept Gihon and Cush at face value. In numerous other passages, when the Bible says Gihon, it means the brook that nurtures Jerusalem. When it says Cush, it means the African nation. The success of the Jerusalem-Napata alliance provides the necessary logic for this metaphorical relationship. What we have here, in other words, is the Bible paying an exceedingly high compliment to the Cushites. Indeed, the Gihon does not only go to Cush, it flows all around the whole land of Cush, as if embracing it. Genesis also contains another generally underappreciated tribute to Cush. A few verses after discussing Noah's 3 sons in relation to the drinking incident, Genesis 10, verses 6 to 7, describe those sons' own descendants. This represents the beginning of the Bible's famous Table of Nations, that is, the book of Genesis' explanation for the origin of the various peoples of the world. A common assumption among scholars is that aside from the B writers passing reference to Taharka, aside from the B1 writers passing reference to Taharka, the Hebrew Bible mentions by name no Cushite monarch. The assumption reflects the widespread confidence that in the Hebrew view of the outside world, the 25th dynasty had only a minuscule presence. Interestingly, however, one recounts the curse of Ham, or more accurately, the curse of Canaan. Genesis goes on to present the Table of Nations and to name the descendants of Noah 3 sons. Sandwiched between the account of Japheth's progeny and Shem's is a list of Ham's line. It begins this way. The descendants of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan. The descendants of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, Sabteka. Each of the 2 sentences is of unusual interest. In listing the sons of Ham in the first sentence, the author of the passage places Cush at the beginning, giving it precedence over the great civilization of Egypt. To be sure, the order of the countries could be chance, so let's not make too much of it, but look at the second sentence, as we saw in chapter 8, Michael Ashtor proposes. The name Sabteka certainly refers to Chpt, but there is something else. Astor's linguistic analysis also leads him to conclude that Sabta would probably allude to Shabako. If Astor is right, the passage would mean that these 2 25th dynasty pharaohs carried significant weight in Hebrew tradition. For a monarch to merit a place in the genealogical tree of humanity is already quite extraordinary. Here we have 2 contemporaries from the same nation. As we saw in chapter 6, it is likely that these pharaohs ruled jointly as co-regents during a period that included the crisis of 701. Chpt, the younger and more vigorous of the pharaohs, would have planned the audacious expedition to Kor, while Shabako, as the senior sovereign, would have to apply his seal of approval to the treaty with Sennacherib. The Bible's view of Cushites, then, is anything but derogatory. The Bible neither glorifies nor scorns the Cushites, but treats them sympathetically. This positive depiction already exists in the passages describing events immediately prior to 701, and as prophecies of Cushites' deference to Yahweh suggests in Isaiah 18 and Psalm 68. In subsequent generations, the Bible's respectful view of Cush only gathered strength. Against the background that this book is representing of a Cushite rescue of Jerusalem, the idea in Genesis 2 of connecting Zion's sacred waters to Cush, breathtaking as the symbolism is, makes sense. Let us go back to the verse from Amos with which this chapter began. Are not you Israelites the same to me as the Cushites, declares the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt? Does a positive interpretation of Cush in this passage still seem so far-fetched? Far from such a comparison being humiliating to Judah, it is, to say the least, glowingly favorable. Both peoples have a relationship with Yahweh that is special.